Hello everyone, today we talk about the Arab contribution to the Achaemenid armies. That is really a secondary topic in the bigger picture, but that is still importantly documented both historically with, for example, the Achaemenid 8th Corps of the cavalry, containing these mostly Arab camelled troops during Xerxes' invasion of Greece in 480. And that, however, speaks of this long range and decentralized influence of the Achaemenid Empire in Arabia, not just the northwest, that was the one that, since essentially Cambyses' expedition in Egypt had, we'll see later, had closed the ties between the Persians and these Arab tribes, but also the southeast of Arabia, areas like Oman. We were not overwhelmingly documented about this, but it does seem through historical records that we're talking about exactly this those populations, the Maccas. We will look at them a bit better. The first group in the northwest, instead being the Kedarites or Khedri, as they were called. It's a topic we partially explored when we made that video about the Ethiopian troops in the Achaemenid army. Of course, Ecumenic Empire, so the Persians took great pride at that point in their, in fact, world domination, in the capacity of getting different peoples at the edges of the world, de facto, to fight for them, right? And just because of their magnitude of God-given power. So today I picked the Arab camel troops as sort of the historical unit type, just to categorize the Arab forces. But of course, there was more to that. We will look at this in different videos about Arab warfare. We don't talk about that much, especially in antiquity, because yes, we know relatively less. They were not that Arabia had an important civilizational development as far as the southwest especially was concerned, but in the bigger picture, again, this was a relatively isolated area, at least the strait with the African Horn and the general this advantage provided by the just geography in the midst of this major routes from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea would make, we've seen it for the Ethiopians as well, not really, given the local availability of manpower resources, we really need to move more than much to launch into major, conquests, or having any, again, capability in doing so. But evidently for the Achaemenid Empire, it was another story. You can see the inequality of that relation. Of course, we will talk about these Semitic peoples, broadly meant also for our Bronze Age warfare series. As a matter of fact, the main source on which we look, and you can't see it, in fact, here at the beginning of the video, we styled this Arab camel riders is from the reliefs of Ashurbanipal's palace during the Assyrian times, that actually document a fight between the Assyrian soldiers and these Kedarite Arab warriors that are being chased, right? And as they are fleeing on camels, and yet they also strike back. Then less military and less certain evidence comes from the Arabian throne bearer from the Tomb 2 at Persepolis, right? That we will mostly exemplify against these tributary peoples in their stylized yet, relatively difficult to distinguish type of populations in their traditional attire. And there are in this case, like both the Arabians and the Maccas, the latter from the Tomb 3rd, and then we have an Achaemenid seal with a horseman and a camel rider, and just we think this guy may have been an Arab, but we're not really sure about such iconography. But speaking of the first source, you can derive this concept of, 2 men per camel, right? More usually, you would have had only one. You can see a zaira in the original illustration, that is a pouch or bag that was worn around the waist. And these troops, mounted troops, are typically bowmen as well, right? You know that camels sort of make horses nervous, which is something that Cyrus the Great was aware before his battle of Thymbra against the Lydians, right, against Sardis back in 546, but we'll see it partly later. The point is understanding how much would the Achaemenid rely on Arab troops. A few, of course, because of the distance, because of the fact that these Arab populations, and mostly again the ones that the Achaemenids could get troops from, were semi-nomadic, right? Were sedentary populations. There was a degree of urbanization as well in more developed areas, but overall, right, especially those who would go out there fighting for a living, tended to be semi-nomads because they were more warlike, they were hungrier, right? Of course, you would have an important degree of segmentation within them at a social and consequently also military level. But of course, we're talking about light troops, tendentially, and plus with this bonus of camel troops that could turn out to be useful in what had been definitely gaining foot as cavalry, as a fully developed arm, right, by this early Iron Age, right? Remember that cavalry proper, not chariotry, was something relatively recent, right? In a properly collectively trained, tactically useful fashion, right? And so the Persians as well were particularly influenced by a hell of a steppe culture that combined with their sedentary possessions acquired, in fact, from sort of hybrid background coming from the Iranian plateau, knew how to handle pretty well in a quite elaborated combined armed tactics for the time beings, including also chariotry, telling the truth. This is something that we often forget when we look at, Xerxes' army in Greece. Like, we have the idea that for some reason, a technological one, the Greeks would have been sort of more advanced, but we tend to overlook the fact that the Achaemenid army was actually much better trained as a whole, in a collective sense, civilizationally speaking, than the hoplitic armies of the Hellenic polis. And that's not, on the contrary, this does not diminish the ultimate Hellenic victory in success in repelling the Achaemenid invasions, but that's a talk we will have to do at some point, because the Achaemenid army was far from the concept of the sort of horde of some sort of untrained and loosely put together forces that sometimes they are depicted like, for reasons that are not really, they lay in history, but they're not historical in the craft's sense, right? So there is not so much to tell about this particular unit type. We just characterize it here as one guy, like essentially a camel rider plus a camel archer, right? Not to say horse archer, as the unit here, right? And the way they would be employed, of course, is basically not clear. At least we can easily think of how the units had a sort of cavalry equivalence, and especially among the Arabs, right? That did have cavalry as well, but that were useful in many ways within the same Arab environment, more than say somewhere else where the Achaemenids would have more frequently had to fight, right? We see some, in fact, even anti-horse capacity in a psychological sense. Again, the horses get nervous around the camels, but you have fundamentally as an arm, like here, a shock capacity of some sort, plus a missile one, and altogether, they're even combined, they're not this enormous much, right? But it's still something you have to cope with at a point, and say, of course, populations inhabiting the Mesopotamia, like, where the Achaemenids fundamentally based themselves on, aside from the more urbanized area of western Iran, where, yes, we're heavy, we're bulkier. They had larger, better drilled, like supplied armies, etc. But we're not tremendously heavy in a general sense, right? The average Achaemenid warrior was fundamentally unarmored, right? Unless you consider some organic garment or skin, whatever that could be considered as such, especially among the Masharex mountaineers or something like that. But that was not the point, because again, the Achaemenids mostly counted on combined arms operations, and as such, they tended to privilege that maneuver and movement that, as we were saying before, for example, in Greece, that territory is quite complicated to carry out, especially when you're so far from home as well, in terms of logistical strains, etc. But that indeed is not that distant even from this more primitive savage populations from which they could draw, like troops. We've seen the Ethiopian infantry being also about archery. There was, of course, a similarity and influence historically between Arabia and the Horn of Africa in terms of, especially again in the touching point, the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, you would have more, let's say, the top of those local sanitary development, right? Whereas all around, the more likely community was something much more, again, wild, semi-nomadic, and so also poorly equipped, etc. But again, the individualistic, warlike dimension could be profitably channeled within sort of more collective operation with the right commanders, with the right minimal sort of habituation of these troops. To some degree, the Achaemenid army have to imagine, say, again, in relative terms to the other nationalities, of course, the Arabs not representing a particularly large component of the Achaemenid army, but still, considering the size of the Achaemenid Empire, still a fairly large amount of troops that would have been more or less regularly serving in the Persian armies just out of, I need a job, right? And that would do, especially for someone who could content themselves with the very few they had been habituated to, like, in comparison, back home, right? And there were different roles that these troops could perform, even just as sort of garrisons, right? If you rely on as main combat forces, of course, the Persian troops, you will not leave them behind, saying during the invasion of different lands, you want to have them on the front line. Maybe you will leave these guys under some sort of Persian official mixed with other troops, checking one another as a garrison, right? The towns that you have occupied along the way, right? So that's something we can't reconstruct just because it's not documented, right, extensively. We just had this a very episodic info dedicated on to especially this this more exotic troops of the Persian army. But they were still there, and they were still relevant enough to be characterized to sort of, again, there is a bit of the stereotype, this differentiation, right? From the Achaemenid side, would symbolically stem from the idea, oh, the world is different and corrupted and degenerated in different ways. We are the only ones that are going to put back this together according to the imperial tradition. From the Hellenic point of view, there of course, think, Herodotus, and it's sort of the already sort of categorical mindset that wanted to say, okay, look, these were the actual troops and what they were fundamentally equipped like, right? Which was, of course, and you have this prototype. Of course, not all troops would be like that. It's also, you should enter the mindset of the author, of course, to understand why he evidently chose to make that distinction, knowing perfectly well that it wasn't just about those types of troops. But enough, however, for us and for them at least, to understand that depending on how they were armed and kept, they were coming from somewhere. And remember always this, that the Greeks, especially those, again, born in Ionia, in Asia Minor, so technically within the Achaemenid Empire, and it's sort of debatable also by which extent also Hellas proper was in Europe actually part of the Achaemenid Empire, right? Because where's the limit, right? It's like saying that, I don't know, the Germans on the east bank of the Rhine were not under the Romans just because the Romans, at least for most of their times, did not control the territory from the other side. De facto, right? They at least underwent a major osmosis, and of course this also stimulated in this case the Hellenic civilization, how we know it, and I hope we'll come back to talk about this. I was thinking at some point ideally to start also some monolithic Hellenic history, not just Hellenic warfare, but let's see where we go with this. The Arabs, however, do have a relevance within the sort of border troops, like the frontier peoples of the Achaemenid Empire, meaning that, militarily speaking, being client of Persia, they, and historically so from quite a while, not just the Greek-Persian wars, they had, of course, gravitated around certain centers. This was true also before, as we will see, for in relation to the Babylonians, right? So at least this connection with Mesopotamia had always been there. I mean, if you, everything south of the Fertile Crescent technically is, in classical ethnography, considerable as Arabs practically. So they're just Semites with different degrees of exposure to this broader civilization. It always, in the north, tried to destabilize, or at least, profiting from the destabilization of, in order to invade, etc. We have looked at the Amorites. We've looked at other groups, also with sort of less clear ethnic origin, that from this desert pushed north, settling as far as northwestern Syria, etc. We've seen it with the Neo-Hittite army, etc. We will look at that again, mostly in the Bronze Age warfare again, right? When Cambyses, the Persian monarch, invaded Egypt in 525 BC, he secured the cooperation of what was considered the Arabian king, of course, in a non-absolute sense. Herodotus states that, quote, the Arabs were never reduced to subjection, which kind of makes sense. I mean, the Achaemenids were just not even particularly interested to go there. I mean, Persian power reactivating historically would go there, say in Sasanian times, or of course, whatever kind of subjection it did exist, even at this time, was very decentralized, and there was really no need, no care for the Persian Empire, even just to occupy directly these places. They automatically just revolved around their power in a centripetal fashion. So it was not important to go as far as that, considering all the better territories that the Achaemenids could conquer all around. It would strive to do. They wouldn't lack the logistics. It just was the strategic projection was just about the cost-benefit ratio, right? Herodotus tells us that because of this sort of probably also relatively informal connection, the Arabs would voluntarily present gifts, right, to the Persians, which was actually the equivalent of paying a tribute. The only difference being that it wasn't so harshly requested, demanded, imposed, right? It was just enough for these Arabs to gain consensus, to search for sympathy from the Achaemenids, all the benefits, the profits they could have from that through cooptation, this trade arrangements, that even just sending a gift saying, let's trade, let's have fundamentally peaceful relations, was seen as an enough of a tribute, right? Naturally, we literally rely just on this information, so you can understand how at some point throughout all this time the Persians would surely impose some form of tributes. There were many different groups, right, that we're not going to descend particularly in depth with. We could make other videos about Arabia, specifically at this time, to understand better who was who out there, but it's not even entirely clear on the base of historical records, as we will see now, right? The areas closer to civilization are better documented, they were more developed, so they left more sources in the historical records, whereas the others are just like, who knows, right? It's not entirely clear. We have a broader idea, like from archaeology, etc., but political groups are another story, right? You can't, that's the most important thing in history, and archaeology does not quite solve that. At least, statistically, we rely overwhelmingly and obviously and forcibly so on historical accounts to determine that. The rest being just a complement, a support. So the major Achaemenid Arab clients were the aforementioned Kedarites, also known as Kidrai, in Greek. These were essentially a nomadic Arab tribe inhabiting the area of northern Arabia, modern day Saudi Arabia and Jordan, right? So we're talking the northwest, right? They had been subdued by the Neo-Babylonian kings back in the day. I recently made a video about the battle of the Ulai River that sort of exemplifies the relations between sort of the Mesopotamia and Iran at the time, again, of the Neo-Babylonians and the Elamites at the very boundary further south with the Arabic world, down the Persian Gulf, and the destabilization that such groups had brought in this broader conflicts were due to essentially raiders, bands, like we see in terms of Bedouin warfare, fundamentally, aside from a greater or lesser development of cavalry and sort of the sophistication also of the surrounding civilizations remains fundamentally unchanged, right? Politically, the Kedarites were organized into a loose confederation of tribes, each one of them being led by some leader, sort of sheikh. And while the Kedarites did not have a centralized political system, they were known for their capacity to cooperate and unite when faced with common threats or enemies. Militarily speaking, they were, again, essentially a warlike raiding population. They were known for their swift mounted forces. In fact, they were expert in desert warfare, needless to say. Of course, they lived at the outskirts of civilization because they didn't have essentially the power to do much more. They had been often hired as mercenaries by larger empires, such as, again, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. These were allies as enemies, depending on the groups of the Kedarites, which tribes would participate with the side of whom they were chronically fragmented as well. the fact that they're represented as mounted troops, they're recorded also as again in the Greek sources as having this mounted troops on camels is fascinating, because of course it reflects that, again, raiding mounted capacity, and they would have been skilled with, especially the most militarized groups. They were essentially nomadic as well, so this would encourage their movement also as mercenary in other people's services, right? So in the 5th century BC, you have actual Kedarite monarchic inscriptions, like from single Kedarite kings, ranging from Tema and Dedan in Arabia. Right, Tema is believed to have been located in the northwestern region of today's Saudi Arabia, while Dedan was located in the Hejaz region near the city of Alula. Right, up to Edom, that was located, set in the southern region of what is now Jordan and Israel, bordering Saudi Arabia, Sinai Peninsula, and the Nile Delta. All right, so quite stretched, as we've seen also this from some videos about ancient Egyptian warfare. It was completely normal to have these desert peoples around with their nomadic lifestyle and crossing, like, I don't know, say all these areas, also arriving, I don't know, into the Libyan desert, moving from Asia to Africa and vice versa, right? So aside, of course, from the sedentary civilization of the florid, major river ways, the hinterland of these regions was pretty semi-desertic at best, and so the communities inhabiting it were organized accordingly. The inscription we just mentioned were not made by Kedarite governments. These were sort of too primitive in a way just to render us much evidence in itself, but they were Egyptian, right? And they can be interpreted in different ways, but in practice it would indicate both the employment of Kedarite mercenaries and at the same time indicating trading activities under the patronage of the Kedarite kings that are named in these contexts, right? So it was a sort of partnership, and again, a long practice in terms of, again, mercenarism, trade, exchange. Again, we've seen in the videos about the Amorites how this local war bands were moving together just like also for trade. It was like, think about Viking times, right? It would come to sack, pillage, but also just simply to trade. At the same time, depending on the circumstances, they used to travel, in that case also with all their families, being able to cross again through various paths, right? A great sense of orientation and capacity of terrain exploitation, like this actually pretty deadly territories at some point in terms of lack of water, also just fresh one, and with very primitive means. But this added in a way to the ease in passing to arms when things went wrong, that they were habituated to quite frequently. In the 4th century BC, the Kedarite power seems to have declined, and we witnessed to the rise of the Nabateans. In the area historically, these mechanisms occur pretty much always in the same way. There's some sort of, again, people comes on the fort, they have the moral load, they manage to take over some sort of territory belonging to other power groups that have collapsed, then they sort of exhaust themselves, they gentrify and sort of hungrier peoples from the wilder areas sort of come in. Again, of course, there are complex games of power we can't see out there. Surely the Achaemenids were pulling the strings of parts of this mechanism, because they were interested especially in maintaining the trade routes open, also via land. But we can imagine also in the Red Sea this bringing to some disruption in the local ports, and so in the stability of maritime traffics. And the Nabateans, in this case, however, seem to have been actually the opponents of Persia, right? So, of course, the wilder peoples were seen as the more threatening for the broader order, and so the Achaemenids would have, of course, have cultivated their own Kedarites, as we've seen from quite a while, given that, again, this people was already there before they came around the region in the first place, from centuries, interacting again with major powers around, and the Nabateans emerging with some, in fact, imposing assertive attitude in this context, right? So, speaking of Xerxes' expedition to Greece in 480 and 79, we see the Arabs providing archers, both on foot and on mounted camels, right? Herodotus 769 says they wore girdled up cloaks and carried their right sides backward, curving bows, right? This is fascinating because, as we were saying before, the actual consistency of these Arab forces would have been relatively loose. Again, as raiders, as predators, they didn't have much of a, even just the capacity of putting together enough force to concentrate, having, bulky, let's say, infantries in large numbers, or at least, of course, the Arabs did have this too, not just in the more urbanized areas in the southwest of their peninsula. And, of course, we can't think that a substantial part of the Arabs serving in the Achaemenid armies were actually also heavies, right? They would have interacted with heavier troops of the Achaemenid military, as well as one of other peoples. Generally speaking, they would have been seen, again, as mostly archers, either mounted or dismounted. That would have been the more common type of trooper, but they're still light troops as such. And so, aside from the fact that they may have sort of had important hand-to-hand combat capabilities to some extent, because they may have not been using bows only, just as individual fighters, but they more typically, yes, would have had the need of some sort of stopping power, at least. So some lancers or stuff like that, mounted, dismounted equally, but most of their forces again being lights, archers fundamentally. And we do see from the aforementioned Ashurbanipal's palace reliefs 2 Arab archers mounted on 1 camel. This seems to have been the same case for Cyrus the Great's camel corps fighting against Sardis back in 546 BC. This was really hastily improvised camel corps that Cyrus used to fight the superior Lydian cavalry, right, to disturb them. And so this tells us that actually this at least on that occasion, the Arab forces were not properly, let's say, organized with a fixed unit, right, of corps that, yes, we can imagine these guys arriving from different tribes, from different backgrounds, and just being grouped together for the occasion, mostly because their camels, again, would scare the horses, and not because they had much cohesion. So the general quality of these troops in terms of collective training was poor, and so the average of the unit was poor. Individually was another story. Individually they were very skilled, were very capable, but again, what matters is how they operated in one unit. And again, this does not suggest does not inspire particular cohesion, right? Herodotus does not speak the double rider for Xerxes' Hellenic expedition, but surely so for Cyrus' Lydian one 3 generations before, right? So at least there's nothing there to imply that there is the specification for the latter expedition, but not for, again, the average cameled units in 480 BC. Right. Now, the extent of Achaemenid control on Arabia, as we were saying before, is also a matter of debate the more we look east, right, for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you understand here, we get some Hellenic documentation that helps us dramatically, and the Greeks were much better informed of what was happening in Egypt, given that just they sent their mercenaries at times there as well. And then Eastern Arabia, and here the latitude is significantly high, so the globe is wider, so there are massive distances, as a matter of fact, and the surroundings of Eastern Arabia in Asia are not particularly thriving in terms of documentation. I mean, you have to reach India on the other side across the sea, and in the north you have fundamentally the same Iranian plateau that, however, at large is not providing us, aside from the Achaemenid government in the more centralized areas with this trivial amount of information. Also, Eastern Arabia is considerably less developed than the Western one. So you have lighter troops, you have sort of also, in fact, less quality troops in general. But since it was closer, of course, to the heartland of the Achaemenid Empire, it's possible that the Persians may have controlled another people in the area. We're talking about the Makkah people that we know because they are mentioned in inscriptions and included among the Achaemenid subject peoples in the Persian royal tombs. Again, the Achaemenids cared about this count, collection, description of and characterization of the various subjects of their ecumenic empire. As a consequence, we, again, just get these names. Probably most of the Persians didn't, not even the elite was particularly aware of the customs or the identities of these people in a very strong sense. But they mattered to them, right? And in the aforementioned source, say the tombs, they are represented as wearing short kilts, like the Indians. You know that the Achaemenid royal tombs have this very, in fact, I inserted it very here. I don't know what the order yet because I'm recording. I do it later of the pictures, but Xerxes' tomb, right, depicting Arab soldier, were roughly the 70s of the 5th century. They're pretty stylized, and again, it's a very sort of symbolic picture in many ways. These guys look pretty similar, but they have, I don't know, different beards, different clothing, to an extent that even though that there is this need of uniformity, in fact, these guys are holding the empire, if you want, of the Achaemenids as subjects in the depiction, but they do differ, right? And we see these kilts that are, however, remarkably similar to the one of the Indians, that, speaking of Eastern Arabia, is not, again, that far away, but it's still another reality. They carry short swords, however, which the Indians, that are also represented, don't. And there is a debate, actually, whether these are Arabians or Indians, right? In fact, it was pointed out initially, at least in historiography, that these were Gedrosians, right? Indian people from essentially the sort of eastern, say more or less today's Pakistan on the Indian Ocean. It would have been the Gedrzia region, and yet some tablets from Darius' reign identify Gedrzia as the satrapy of Purush, right, named after its capital Pura, right, and on this account, the name of Makash appears as a separate satrapy within the Achaemenid Empire. The satrapies were sort of provinces that made up the Achaemenid Empire, the head of which was the satrap, who was appointed again by the King of Kings. And so it's relevant enough to see Gedrzia separated by such a name. We know of later Hellenic geographers locating a people called Makai in Oman, right? That's because of the consonants with Makash, and also with Magan, which is a term that you find in earlier pre-Achaemenid Mesopotamian texts that were still all aware, in fact, of Eastern Arabia and in contact with that, may have been the actual Makkah, just spelled again in a different way, but fundamentally the same peoples. And here we're talking again, as also the Achaemenid satrapy shows a level of provincial identification, as we've seen with the Western Arabs. So there was broader areas that were intended, of course, to define one people in a, if you want, national sense. But of course, it's as if they had, I don't know, called the Germans, right, like that, if they had gone that far. But this doesn't mean that actually there was a political unity of any sort. There would have been to some extent, depending on what politics we're discussing, but still we've seen important tribal areas and dimensions, and even areas again that were sort of more advanced but sort of more distant at the same time from Achaemenid power. And so we do not really know, unfortunately, on the basis of this evidence, how much the Achaemenids referred to what in this case. We can reflect also on the Achaemenid use of camel troops in general. It would have been easy for the Persians living so close, at least with considering the extension of the empire, and also relative geographical proximity of their heartland, ethnic heartland, to Arabia, just to get these troops, right, to purchase camels, even training some of their own camel troops, right. So we do have that. We do know they had them. For example, Herodotus describes, together with Xenophon as well, the aforementioned episode of Cyrus fighting the Lydian cavalry. This hastily put together camel corps, scaring the horses of the superior enemy mounted troops, would bring to the double rider. The interesting detail about that episode is also that these camels were not drawn from fighting forces. We were saying before, they were drawn from the baggage train, right? Herodotus speaks of two cavalrymen in general. Xenophon talks about two archers, right? However, we see how these were not typical troops in the Achaemenid army. So while the camels were quite useful also for logistical support, we do know that in Xerxes' army's Arab camel riders are actually a fighting force. I think it's, and that's how I treated them for this video, pretty certain that also against Sardis, the Achaemenid were actually drawing not just the animals, but their riders from some Arab auxiliary force. I mean, it makes sense. Of course, there would have been some Persians versed in, camel warfare to some extent, to be able to fight on camelback. But overall, it sort of makes sense, especially considering say the distance from the Iranian heartland, and the fact that again there would have been camels and mercenaries purchasable from Arabia, that in spite of these troops being part of these animals being part of the baggage train, there may have been some actual camel trooper already present and sort of able to ride these animals, a bit like the Indian mahots would have been maintained, as far as Italy when Pyrrhus invaded the peninsula in 3rd century BC. Less, of course, of a qualification than for the elephants, but again, we can think we're reasonably certain to think that in that occasion, the 6th century BC, Cyrus actually had invaded Lydia with some actual Arab auxiliaries that were in part also mounted on camel, and in part these animals may have used from the baggage train as well, as the source states, but not because they were necessarily just treated as pack animals just per se, right? Because at the time you would, everything really does, right? The Arabs themselves, of course, before the spread of cavalry, they would use, for example, also donkeys often to carry the stuff, but they would be developing cavalry, also camel troops, sort of in a gradual way, but even as a reaction to cavalry warfare development, but they had sort of a foot bias. In fact, actually, most of their troops were truly on foot, and they said their outlook was, aside from the raiders, not really just about mounted forces in general. As we've seen, we're talking mostly about archers. And so also as horse archery, we don't see much of overwhelming horse archery or camel archery in Arabia. This seems like more like an exotic type of specialty that the Achaemenids may have wanted to have with them. That, of course, the accounts of Herodotus and Xenophon are, as far as say in this context they go back, actually they are accurate, right? There's been always this idea, but what they wrote, especially Herodotus, about things that we do not know, this sounds legendary, and archaeology reconfirms over and over again what these historical accounts are saying, in spite of whatever sort of mistake or arrangement of this narrative may have been about. So in this case, it does seem likely that Cyrus was aware of the use that the camels could be done, right? He would have known the Lydians, or to have had a strong cavalry in general, and that camels were useful as far as scaring the horses were concerned. Like, we can't think Cyrus not to have known that, or to have really learned out of scratch recently. So this is part of the narrative, which may have added up to the tension, to the shrewdness, to the sort of quick-minded decision of this great ruler. But it's likely that if this thing happened at all, at least in a relevant degree, this was in fact coming from some sort of better organized, at least camel force, which could even indicate technically that the Achaemenids did not have much trust in, say, the Arab auxiliaries or in their camels, to the point of treating them some sort of elite units that were bringing with them just to scare horses, whatever. But there were surely some connections with the idea still that camels can be very used as pack animals in the baggage train, but in certain eventualities, if you had to use them, especially in this anti-cavalry function, you would have some auxiliary troops from your this varied ethnic pool that the Persians could draw from, that knew how to also fight on them to the best, and so you would pick the same guys that likely had arrived in Achaemenid army with some camel as well. So that's how much we know. The level of detail, right, is sort of, limiting our. These are just speculations at best, right? But it's important to understand that there is a divide between fighting in a way and just being effective as a unit, as a wall. And the Arabs do not seem to have been particularly high military quality. So again, the Achaemenids were the most advanced army at that point, and they would have preferably relied on their own cavalry, their own infantry. But when these guys could be put together, they knew again that they couldn't do miracles. But still, if the camel ideally could serve that anti-horse function, it could have been resorted to. And again, that's all we know as a narrative, not much else, right? So we will talk about other Arab warfare along the way from this time, and not only. It's important to stress again that most Arab troops, numerically in terms of individual trooper, were not camel troops. Of course, they were not even mounted troops. Seemingly, they were mostly archers. In any case, dismounted ones. And again, there would have been mounted ones as well. And camel warfare is interesting. It's not you can't do with a camel exactly what you do with a horse, right? But that's also a matter of fact of mass. And at that point, if the psychological effect is just about fielding them in large enough numbers, even with not so much closely knit sort of unit fighters, because there is no pre-existing core, well, still, you may want to use them and trust in them partly to the guys who know how to ride them, just because back at home they are sort of skilled in doing that, right? Very well, so for today I stop it here. We will keep talking about the Achaemenid army. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.